All right. So I am getting closer to the end of this lecture series that we've been spending some time on together on justice, care, ethics, and the lifespan revolution. We'll see how it goes today, but I suspect maybe one at most two more lectures on these topics. And there is a fair bit happening in our politics that I'm keeping track of and will be back to speaking with you about in coming weeks. And if anything really urgent arises, we'll take a break again to talk about it instead of just continuing with the lecture series. But for now, I think we're well served to try to get as close to the end as we can. And so today I'm going to push us through, I think, the first big transition. We've tried to get as good a perspective as we can on the lifespan revolution, the fact that we are living longer than humans have ever lived, and not just by a decade, but by maybe 4 decades. That at the beginning of the 19th century, there was not a society in the world that had a life expectancy over 40 years. At the beginning of the 21st century, there's not a society in the world that has a life expectancy under 40 years, right? And that just begins to get at what we're talking about. Another way to express this is that on average, we added more years to the human lifespan in the 20th century than had been added in all of human history combined up until that point. And whether it's medical or technological or sanitation or nutrition, you bring it all together, and modern civilization seems to be getting us to the point where many human beings, especially in developed societies, will soon be living as long as human beings can live, which is about 120 years, right? And so the children born today are more likely to live to be 100 than not. And that this is not just stretching the human life. The literature that I've tried to introduce you to argues, I think, quite powerfully that the prospect here is not just for living longer, but for having greater well being in the extra 40 to 60 years of human life that we are now creating for ourselves. And that elderhood, this third chapter in the story of human life, can be a period of well-being, of flourishing, of meaning. It should not be judged by the standards of adulthood. If we do, then we're going to be disappointed. But if we judge it by its own internal standards, as we do childhood, then we in fact will recognize that the prospects for this being a period of flourishing are very good. But this requires changing attitudes, changing policy, changing social structures, changing our own orientation, right? And so that's the foundation I've tried to lay for our discussion using that body of literature. The central takeaways, now that we're concluding this unit, is that the medical model of aging as disease, debility, and decline, as if it's just all in one direction and all downhill, is inaccurate and damaging, right? Inaccurate in the sense that it's just not true, and damaging because we internalize it. And this reflects the fact that we've ceded a great deal of authority to the medical model of aging, and it has strong influence in the broader culture. And as we internalize it, as we understand ourselves and behave in its accord, we are diminishing our prospects for well-being, for flourishing, for agency as we get older. So the alternative picture, the more accurate picture that emerges from medicine and neuroscience, from biology and from large longitudinal studies, is that aging is doubly heterogeneous. Sorry for the jargon, but internally diverse in two respects. First of all, different people experience different aspects of aging at different chronological ages. And so the chronological age, right? I'm 58 years old, right? That's the number of years since my birth. But does that mean that there's a typical level of health, well-being, cognition for a 58-year-old? Absolutely not, right? And so biological and chronological age are distinct. If you look in my body for the markers of aging, you'll find them, but you won't find them to the same degree that you find them in other people, or you may find them to a more extreme degree than you find them in other people. And so different people age at different rates. That's the first thing to see. And although it's extraordinary, there are 80 and 90-year-olds starting to do triathlons, marathons, and competitive swimming, right? And clearly I'm not going to do that, but different people age in different ways. So this is true for the body, including your overall physical functionality and the kinds and rates of disease that you may develop. Different people function in different ways and develop diseases at different rates. It's also true for the brain, including memory, intelligence, and overall cognitive speed and ease. Declines for some people in their 60s, for some people in their 90s. They're pretty much as sharp as they were in their 40s and 50s. And so then the second aspect of heterogeneity or of internal difference here is that different aspects of decline associated with aging occur in the same individuals in both the body and the brain at different rates. And so it's not a uniform process of decline across the board. And not only that, but decline and growth sometimes occur simultaneously and allow for forms of compensation, right? And so we noted that certain aspects of conscientiousness and executive order thinking become easier as you get older, and you can use that to compensate for instance, some decline in short-term memory by getting more organized and making sure you always put things in the same place so you know where they are when you look for them, right? And so that's just a simple example of the idea that as opposed to everything going downhill at the same rate at the same time, some things are going downhill, some things are on the level, some things are increasing. It's a much more diverse process, aging, than the medical stereotype suggests. Third, our attitudes about aging have an important influence on how we experience these processes, right? So one way to put this is that our experience of aging is mediated by our beliefs about aging. We don't just experience aging because of its physical attributes. We experience it in an interpretive lens based on our attitudes about it. And so this influences our psychology in obvious ways, and it's part of the damage that the medical model and ageism do to us. But, and I think this is critical to notice, it also influences our behavior, right? And so if we think that getting old means becoming inactive, then we're going to become inactive when we age. And that is not a necessary consequence of aging, though it may be a powerful stereotype. And then finally, our age-related beliefs also influence our physiological health. And I spoke with you last week about Becca Levy's research. I'll review just a little bit of that today, but I think it's very powerful in suggesting not only that it's clear that people with positive age beliefs age better than people with negative age beliefs, right? That they have better functionality, they have greater longevity, they have lower rates of dementia and stress and heart disease. But she also is very good at influencing the causal mechanisms via which the psychology that results from negative age beliefs results in biological aging. And so this is a model that really helps us to understand how mind and body are connected to each other, what mechanisms connect them. So then finally, ubiquitous, mainly uncontested ageism is a prejudice that is internalized deeply in youth and adulthood, right? And we talked about this before, that ageism seems to be one of the few forms of discrimination. I think we could add anti-trans discrimination, transsexual discrimination to this, that is routinely tolerated and not seen as disqualifying socially in the way, say, that racism is today. Um, and that we end up, therefore, internalizing prejudice against our own future selves. And that prejudice is also reinforced by the way in which our social world is built, the lack of access to people with a full range of capabilities, including the capabilities typical of being 80 or 90 years old. So the world is built on the assumptions of ageism as opposed to creating universal access. And that makes the stereotype, the prejudice, seem in a sense to be warranted. Of course, aging has declined. You don't see old people out and about the way you see young people. That is then reinforcing and allowing that prejudice to take hold strongly within us. And it's therefore difficult to dislodge once we actually reach the age at which it applies to us. But there are effective steps to be taken against it. And this is where we left off last week. And I did, Bob, you had asked, Bob, are you on the chat today? You had asked this question at the very end.
I'm here.
Are you? I'm trying to get out to see if you're here. Yes, you are. And did Amy forward that to you? I made available to Amy a copy of the appendix of Becca Levy's book that suggests concrete strategies for countering the internalization of ageism. And so Amy has that. Feel free to bother her, and hopefully she'll be able to get it to you. But the other thing we discussed is putting a copy of Becca Levy's book in the library so that everyone can have access. And the appendix is at the end of the book, the ABCs of combating ageism. So that should be available to you through Amy and hopefully through the library soon. Oops, hold on, got to get the right, that's not the right one. Where am I? That's the right one. All right, so there are effective steps to be taken against it, against the internalization of negative age beliefs and age prejudice. Diagrammatically, the suggestion here from Louise Aronson is that we actually separate life not into two major phases or chapters with a kind of, postscript, and then I retired, but that's not really part of my life. But three, I have a childhood, I have an adulthood, I have an elderhood. These are distinct phases. They should be judged by the age relevant or appropriate attitudes and values for each. Just as we don't call children deficient adults, we shouldn't call elders declining adults, right? We should judge elderhood by its own standards and recognize at this point it constitutes practically a third or more of our lives, and that it's important not to neglect, but instead to maximize the value to be had in those years. And then from Levy's work, just a quick summary of what I think of as some of her most important findings. First of all, the difference between levels of stress of the actual presence of the biomarker of stress, cortisol production. And that is a huge health liability to have elevated levels of it among people who have positive age beliefs and people who have negative age beliefs. And as you can see, this research started when these people were 30 years old and went up to the time that they were 60 years old, I believe, if I've got this right. And as you can see, the people with positive age beliefs started out actually with slightly more stress, but it consistently went down over the course of the study. The people with negative age beliefs, their cortisol level went up to the point where it's more than twice as high as the people with positive age beliefs. Then, and I think in a sense, probably mainly explained by this diagram, the idea that people who have positive age beliefs are living 7.5 years longer on average than people with negative age beliefs, that the mortality rate for people with positive age beliefs is lower than the death rate for people with negative age beliefs, and that the people with positive age beliefs who have a predisposition genetically to Alzheimer's are getting it at about half the rate of people with negative age beliefs, and actually getting Alzheimer's less frequently than the people who don't have the genetic predisposition to it, but do have negative age beliefs. And so again, just I think some really convincing evidence that we damage ourselves when we are prejudiced against our future selves, especially when we become our future selves. And so just a few quick quotes to summarize what I think are the most important takeaways from this first group of thinkers. A couple of them from Levitin and then one from Laura Carstensen. Levitin says, talking about the brain, that if you're like me, I think the thing I care most about is the retention of my cognitive capacity. And I find, though I don't particularly like the language, this passage to be incredibly reassuring. Sophisticated experimental techniques suggest the brain is more like a Disney-esque animated sea creature. Constantly oozing in various directions, it's apparently able to respond to injury with striking functional reorganization and can at times actually think itself into a new anatomical configuration. And the point there, right? So somebody loses their vision, and it turns out they repurpose aspects of their visual cortex, which is no longer getting stimulation from the ocular nerves, to handle their auditory input and to start, in a sense, constructing a physical map of the world based on what they hear around them. And we don't have radar like bats, obviously, and yet we seem to be able to do something akin to that if we lose our sight. And so the implication of this for the field of aging and the lifespan revolution is, yes, there are aspects of the mental process that become impaired. Cognitive impairment does occur as we age, but that's not uniform. We continue to learn, we continue to have neuroplasticity, and we can actually learn to compensate for those aspects of decline. So, second big idea from Levitin, and this I think is where, in a sense, all of this reading converges. I've come to see a future in which we can plan ahead to fend off some of the adverse effects of aging, a future in which we can harness what we know about neuroplasticity to write our own next chapters the way we want them to come out, a future in which healthy lifestyle choices and a broader use of medications can temper or reverse the effects of depression and other changes in mood that we have for too long assumed were an irreversible part of aging. I've come to see old age as a unique period of growth, a life stage with its own distinct character rather than a period of decline or a gradual turning down of the dials and knobs one by one. I argue here for a very different vision of old age, one that sees our final decades as a period of blossoming, a resurgence of life that does not chase after our younger years, but instead embraces the gifts that time can bring. Again, I think that's the best single synthetic passage on the takeaway from these ideas. Third and finally, and this is where we're now going to transition to thinking about, okay, we can have long lives that have not just extended lifespans, but extended health spans, and therefore can have good quality years in our 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. And then we have to build our society on the assumption, rebuild, reform our society on the assumption that people are going to live a third longer than they've lived for most of human history, and that we need to make work and public space and care fairly available to all persons across all phases of life. So this is from Laura Carstensen, the head of the Stanford Longevity Center. We must recognize that we are living in a world that was quite literally designed for young people. Only 4% of the population was over 65 in 1900. In a very broad sense, we need to very quickly build a culture, build up that knowledge base, recast the physical environment, and deeply rethink social norms so that the culture that supports us allows people to feel a sense of belonging and purpose and worth for 100 years. That's the new metric our children today will very likely reach. It's our duty to make sure that the world that we live in supports these longer lives, right? And so I won't reproduce that diagram, but if we think of all of the good things that we make available to people in this society, do we make them available across a full life? And Carstensen's diagram suggests that our access to them tails off as we get into our 60s and 70s. So what we need to do is to build out the infrastructure, the cultural resources, the support necessary for people to contribute to society, to pursue goals, to continue to have well-being and health and flourishing all the way through these longer lifespans. All right, so that's what I wanted us to take away from the first unit. And now I want to start discussing the second unit. And here, again, I've got 4 books. I'm not going to spend as much time on each of these 4 books. I'm not going to do a week per book, but I am going to point you to some of the more interesting authors writing, I think, on a variety of topics that really focus on the sociology, economic politics, and ethics of the provision of care. And so let me situate this for a second just by going back a couple slides and pointing out that one of the aspects of elderhood that we do have to acknowledge and be realistic about is that as in particular you get into your 80s and 90s, you become more dependent, less independent. And that is as a result of natural physiological processes that make you less strong, less capable than you were in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? And so the provision of care, right, is going to have to be more robust, better organized, and the distribution of the work of providing that care is going to have to be more fairly distributed in a society that has undergone the lifespan revolution if we're going to have any claim to being a decent and just society. So this is the literature I'm going to point us to that I think helps to begin thinking through these issues. Um, and so I have here Grace Chang, uh, who has done pioneering work looking at where domestic help labor comes from. And so this is not exclusively elder care labor, but also labor that is used in a variety of institutional contexts as cleaners, dishwashers, etc., and also especially at home for people who are middle class, upper middle class, affluent, who use professional care to help with the care of their children. Um, Grace Chang teaches in the UC system and has done some of the pioneering work on this. Ai-jen Poo, I'm not sure whether she'd be familiar with you. She's quite eminent in this field, a MacArthur Genius Fellow, not an academic, an organizer. And I'll say more about her organizing work in a few minutes, but she started in New York City organizing care providers, domestic workers, especially focused on people providing care for the elderly. And as Grace Chang points out, most of the people who do this are women. Most of the people who do this are women of color. Most of the people who provide this labor are immigrants. Some of them are legal immigrants, some of them are undocumented immigrants, and that this creates difficulties in a variety of respects organizing these women, right? And they're working in a quote informal context. Many of them, they're not working for an institution that employs them. They're working for a family that maybe gives them housing, where the family maybe doesn't collect or pay taxes, etc. Right? And so organizing domestic care presents all kinds of challenges that differentiate it from other forms of labor and union organizing. Ai-jen Poo, over the last 20 years, has done a lot of the path-breaking work. Eventually, the work she did in New York spawned several national organizations that are now taking up the mantle of trying to organize some of the most vulnerable, typically exploited workers in our society. And in this book, published I think about 7, 8 years ago, The Age of Dignity, Pooh is anticipating the coming elder boom, as she calls it, and the idea that we need to build, in her language, a infrastructure of care, what she calls a care grid after the electrical grid, to make sure that care is evenly available and fairly provided in terms of not only the recipients of care, but also the people doing the care labor. Nancy Fraser is a contemporary feminist political philosopher. And in her most recent book, Cannibal Capitalism, which was really only published at the beginning of this year, so very new work. The subtitle maybe says a fair bit of what she's talking about: how our system is devouring democracy, care, and the planet, and what we can do about it. And so the idea here is that capitalism requires certain supporting social institutions, that among those supporting social institutions is the family, that we can't have workers if we don't have families. We can't have the people who do the productive labor that generates the goods that makes an economy run, unless those people are cared for, are well enough, have the motivation. You guys just told me, right, that the dining hall is closed because the workers are out sick. That's a very good illustration, right, of the way an economy tends to break down if you don't have workers who have the requisite well-being, motivation, etc. And Fraser points out that for something like the last 40 or 50 years, our economy has been cannibalizing our families, the conditions in which care is provided. And I'm about to get into this, but that's the contribution that Nancy Fraser makes. And then finally, Joan Tronto, who's another political philosopher, University of Minnesota, pioneering feminist thinker, and in particular, one of the pioneers in the field that used to be called the ethics of care. I think we might now call it the politics of care. And in her book, published about a decade ago, she really focused on the question, how could a democracy begin to really handle the question of the fair distribution of care labor, both that which is done outside of the labor market within families, right? And that still remains, I think, for many of us, the model of how care is typically and best provided, but also within the paid labor force of care workers. And she suggests both that care would be better and democracy would be better if we focused on fairly distributing the burdens of providing it, and if we cared more for each other as citizens and uh, fellow inhabitants of our democratic society. So let's begin to get into some of these ideas. And like I say, I'm going to try to synthesize this material for you much more quickly than the previous books to give you an overall sense of the conclusion that these works reach. So the first thing they offer is a historical perspective on the evolution of nature, right? When I say nature, the nature of care labor, but very often this has been naturalized, and it helps us to see that there's nothing natural about it, as I put it there, the provision and distribution of care labor. So it has evolved over time. How do we tell that history? How do we account for its evolution? That will help us to understand why we face a crisis of care in the 21st century. And so it's socially contingent. There's right decisions that are made that shape the provision of care. It is economically influenced, and I really want to emphasize that, right? That how care is provided is very much structured by other demands that the economy places on people. And it is a politically relevant issue, meaning that it can be influenced through legislation, through social movements, through activist politics. It's not simply there, part of second nature, fixed forever and always. So, what changes over time? First, the structure of the family. And as many of these women point out, the family prior to industrialization and the lifespan revolution, so when people were living less, was mainly an extended kin unit, right? It included multiple generations in most societies. And it had a primarily economic structure and function. And so I think we're very used to the idea, because of the economy we live in, that you, quote, go to work, right? That is to say, you leave home and go someplace distinct, right, for work. And what we see in the history here is that, in fact, that is really a very recent phenomenon, the differentiation of home from economic activity. That for most of human history, the primary form of economic activity for most human beings was agricultural subsistence labor, and it occurred right out your front or back door, right? Your home was probably a hut positioned right by the fields that you tilled, the animals that you tended to. And so there wasn't going to work, and everyone in the family shared that labor, right? And so the structure of the family changes, and changes in ways that are relevant to the distribution of care, who provides it, how hard it is, how many liabilities or vulnerabilities attend doing care work. Second thing, then, is that the nature of the provision and division of the responsibility for providing care are that whole complex is variable over time. I think we tend to think that this was, for a very long time, women's work. And frankly, we're a little bit historically myopic about that because, yes, it was women's work, perhaps in the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, but that doesn't mean it was forever and always women's work. And we can tell a very specific social, historical narrative to explain when and how and why it became primarily women's work to do this care labor. So the final thing to see is that how the provision and division of responsibility for providing care have is structured has important consequences for the agency and dignity of both the recipient and the provider of care. And so one way to put this is that this is a two-way street. If the provider of care has dignity, has security, feels respected in doing this work, then it's much sorry, much more likely that they are going to be a kind, caring, generous provider of care. The final thing to note here, right, is that it doesn't just vary over history, it varies across cultures, right? And so there's a big divide between more individualistic cultures like the United States and more sociocentric cultures that, as opposed to putting the individual, put the family first and foremost at the center of moral concern and agency. And that seems to make a huge difference for the way in which care is provided. So the next more detailed chapter in the history, I've talked about the family prior to industrialization, when it was a primarily economic unit and people didn't leave the home but did the work at home. The next phase is early industrialization. And here we're talking about the middle of the 19th century. The poetic term that was used for factories in the middle of the 19th century is that they were dark, satanic mills, right? And so part of what was happening with industrialization was a violent upending of pre-capitalist social bonds, of the idea that the family would be an extended kin unit, that you would stay in the same place across many generations, maybe even be bonded to the land in certain respects. And that, as opposed to that, you get urbanization, you get the breaking up of families, and simultaneously you get the fact that the factories are drawing everyone in, right? Men, women, and children. And in many places in England and the United States, in the early phases of industrialization, there was actually a preference for child labor, for women's labor, because there was a sense that women and children were more docile, more easily controlled, that they had greater dexterity, smaller hands, were able to do some of then the work that men didn't do as well, or resisted and rebelled against doing. And the result was that in the middle of the 19th century, the unregulated labor market was destroying families. There were economists at the time, Karl Marx among them, who tried to calculate how many years was being taken off the average lifespan by these working conditions, right? So it was literally decreasing the lifespan of human beings Marx thought by perhaps decades. And so the idea that an unregulated labor market can destroy the entire way in which a society reproduces itself produced a Victorian reaction. Labor laws, among other things, right? So child labor laws, minimum working age, at the time 12 years old instead of 6 or 10 years old, maximum working hours at the time, right? 70 and then 60 hours a week. So the assumption was that as opposed to working 7 days a week, you would work 6 days a week. Instead of working 12 hours a day, you would work 10 hours a day, right? That this was necessary to protect the basic humanity of workers and the integrity of the family. That this helps us to see that we need regulation in order to protect the carrying capacity of our more organic, non-economic practices and institutions like the family. And so in the late 19th century, we get this right idea that we're going to regulate work. And part of what grows out of this is the idea of the modern restricted family, the family as primarily parents and children. And out of that grows, among other things, an intensification of gender differences and patriarchy. And so Maria Mize has done some very important historiographic work here on, quote, the housewifeification of women in the late 19th, early 20th century, and the what she calls gendered imaginary of separate spheres, the idea that women belong in the home, not in the rough hurly-burly of the work world or the public sphere. And part of that comes out of the fact of how predatory and destructive the working conditions at the middle of the 19th century were, but it gets articulated in this very gendered way. Women are too fragile. The work they do is too relational, too emotional, too infused with empathy and compassion for them to be in the workplace. The right place for them to be is in the home, right? And so again, understanding where ideas that really had a very powerful hold on us in the middle of the 20th century come from, that they're not fixed, fast, frozen constants of human culture, but grew out of relatively recent history. And so this gets us then to the middle of the 20th century regime of care. And this is in the aftermath of the New Deal, among other aspects of it, minimum wage legislation. And let us remember that in the middle of the 20th century, the minimum wage was worth 70% more than it is today, right? That's how much of the value of the minimum wage has been eroded by inflation and failure to have adequate cost of living adjustment. And so the idea that you could have a single family wage that one worker got so that the other member of the family could stay home, care for the children, care for the parents, care for, to put the gender into the mix, the husband, right? This was the wife's role, became normative and was supported via the minimum wage, other aspects of social legislation, unionization, the government uh, assisting the formation of unions, working to regulate the wage bargaining process, contract negotiations, to level the playing field between workers, especially unionized workers, and large corporations. All of this led to a phase in our economy, in the capitalist system, in which we really regulated work and compensation and the demands that work put on the family to try to create a situation in which care could be handled within the family. So we enlisted state power to assist with social reproduction. That included providing public schools so that some of the work of socializing children was done outside of the family, support for education, a family wage, social security, Medicare, all of that assists in uh, providing the scaffolding for care in our society. It, I suppose, almost goes without saying that this was limited by race, gender, and nationality, right? And so not everybody was in the realm of being in a family where the wage earned by the head of household was sufficient to support the entire household. Um, well, the aftermath of this, right, is what begins to happen in the 1970s and really takes hold in the last 40 years of American history. And that is sometimes called the neoliberal regime, right? The period in which we stopped regulating the economy, stopped allowing the minimum wage to keep up, stopped supporting unions. And the result of the overall rise in the prestige of the market and the rise of the market as the model for which we believe the most successful, efficient provision of goods occurs is that we increasingly dovetail, combine that with the idea, and of course, care is provided within the family, so that the responsibility for the provision of care is now private. Whoever does it, does it. It's not the government's worry, it's not society's worry, it's not a collective responsibility. This idea has complex roots, but it goes back to this change in thinking about whether the government is better at meeting these demands or the market is better at meeting these demands, and the shift in favor of the market. It also goes back to a shift in the family and away from the family wage of a single breadwinner and to instead two income households, right? That basically in the late 20th century, certainly in the 21st century, most families cannot sustain themselves on the basis of a single worker's wage. And so both members of the family, if it's a traditional two parent household, go off to work. And this transforms the family. And in particular, it creates a situation, and Arlie Hochschild at UC Berkeley has been one of the pioneers in documenting this, in which women are typically doing what is called the double shift, right? They go to work and do paid labor to bring that wage home to be able to afford the expenses of the house, but they then also come home and do the lion's share of the domestic labor, the care work, the household labor to maintain the house, caring for parents, caring for still the other wage laborer, the husband in the house, if it's that traditional family still. And this is the double shift and the time bind, right? The idea that women are in a sense doing one shift at work, one shift at home, that there's not really enough time to do this well and to take care of yourself and have a little bit of leisure. And so many families that can afford to are increasingly paying for supplemental care labor. That could be childcare, that could be cleaning services, it could be somebody else cooking for you or eating out. It could be somebody to care for your parents or assisting your parents being able to afford staying in a care community. And this in turn has given rise to what are often called care chains in the sense in which, well, who's providing the paid care labor? Well, often those are women as well, often poorer women, but those women are often themselves mothers, maybe single mothers, right? And so they, in order to do this labor, need to have somebody caring for their kids. And so they find even poorer women or relatives or daycare centers. And so this gives rise to this idea of a care chain. And when we look at this labor market, what we see is that it's women, women of color, often immigrants, sometimes undocumented, who are doing the compensated labor of care provision. And so, right, the idea that wage erosion has been extremely important to this whole change in the family, I think is extremely important to see. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I've got some data for you on it. And the idea that these new families with two incomes are really two income trap families. Elizabeth Warren, back when she was a bankruptcy professor at Harvard Law School, did some of the pioneering work on this. Why were there such a ballooning of rates of bankruptcy in the late 90s, early 21st century? Well, in part because the two income families actually don't work. And she showed, I can show you in a moment, that two income families in the late 90s, early 2000s actually had less disposable income than did one income families in the 1970s, because in order to liberate the second worker, they were paying for daycare, they were paying for cleaning, they were eating more meals out, etc. So there's a cultural politics to this shift, and I want to be as clear as possible about this. Women entered the labor force, I think, for a couple distinct reasons. One of them was because it was structurally necessary for them to do so, right? It was simply impossible to afford to support a house with a single household, sorry, with a single wage. But they also did so, many of them, because they wanted equality, because they found the patriarchal family to be stultifying and to undermine their freedom and equality. And so this was part of feminism. But I think in retrospect, feminists and others are becoming clearer about the way in which the channeling of women's demand for emancipation from the patriarchal family, via inclusion in the paid labor market, was a kind of Faustian bargain, given that women, in fact, continue to do the bulk of the domestic labor, in addition to now having paid labor, given that women are forced to give over a fair bit of their wages to pay other people to provide the care that they were previously providing, given the other social and cultural consequences of this change, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And one of those consequences is the erosion of traditional bases for protecting the requirements of care provision and social reproduction. We go back to the 1950s, 1960s. And again, the research here is very interesting. Some of it is social history, some of it is political science using large word searches. But what seems clear is that in the 50s and the 60s, there was more of a sense that it was the responsibility of the society as a whole to make sure that care could be provided to the young and the elderly, the infirm, that we had to structure wages and families and public institutions to make sure that those who required care received care. And that in the intervening years, we've lost the cultural resources with which to articulate those demands. Right now, it's up to the family to figure out how to afford care. It's not a social responsibility anymore. And that is a profound shift and one that is deleterious and paralyzing in terms of our politics and our incapacity to face up to and address the crisis of care in 21st century American society. And so to conclude these ideas, while this is really a quite recent change and one that we can understand once we do this history, where it came from and how we got there. Nevertheless, the politics of care is naturalized. And so I think in many circles, at least, we don't see this as the product of recent social, cultural, and economic history. This is just the way things are. Of course, families are responsible for figuring out how to care for their own children and their dependent parents and other relatives. That's just the nature of things. No, that occurred recently, but we naturalize it, and in so doing, remove it from being a political issue. So in addition to that, I think the fact that the people who do the care labor are women, that it's gendered, that it's privatized both economically and in the family, and that the people who come in and do the paid care labor tend to be women of color, tend to be less educated, tend often to be immigrants, sometimes without documented status, means that the people who might naturally politicize this issue, who might join the social movements, the unions, the organizations that people like Ai-jen Poo are organizing, they're less likely to catch the attention of mainstream politics or to have the social and political power to force the mainstream political parties to pay attention to their demands. So why don't I stop there? I recognize that I'm running up against my time limit and open this up to questions. You guys have let me go again in terms of presenting a lot of information to you. Who wants to start us out with a question or a comment today?
I'll start out if I may.
Go ahead, Matt.
This is Matt.
Yes.
It seems to me that we've gone a pretty long way in providing for medical care, at least, for people not only seniors with Medicare, but also an awful lot of employment involves HMO membership. And so I'm wondering whether we really are taking care back into the family to the extent that I sort of hear you suggesting.
So I think you're absolutely right that Medicare in particular, and then we could talk about, we would probably want to add Medicaid, Obamacare, and then the patchwork system of employee-based healthcare insurance, right? But that we're in a place where the large majority of Americans have some sort of medical insurance provision, right? But and at some point I'm going to ask John Campbell to speak about this, because John, sorry, I should have given you advance notice, but maybe not today. But John has studied the Japanese provision of long-term care insurance as a social right, and so, right, one thing we don't do, right, we provide medical care unevenly, but better than we have in the past on what's sometimes called a disease treatment model, right? We're not very good at doing preventative care, but we're pretty good at intervening once you're sick, right? Having said that, the kind of care that many people need in elderhood is not simply disease management, right? Yes, sooner or later, probably most of us will need that as well. But it's also more routine, day-to-day functional care. And we don't provide that via the medical care system. We do provide it unevenly via social services, typically at the municipal level. There is some of that as well. But in ways that I haven't been able to say today, I think the evidence is very clear. The language here is crisis of care, that we don't do this well enough as a society, and that we're seeing the signs of the neglect of care. So yes, John, I don't want to minimize the degree to which we took on the social provision of care, but please note also, right, that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the three big programs here, are all products of the middle of the 20th century. And that's actually a period in which I'm suggesting we were better at acknowledging the social responsibility here. Obamacare, that's a more recent program, and that's an interesting story to try to reconcile with the narrative I've been providing. But it seems that we are increasingly less likely to extend and more likely to contract or rescind the kinds of programs that we began in the 1930s. John, go ahead. You're still muted, John.
So I am, thank you. Ruth and I think would be happy to talk sometime about long-term care in Japan. We both spent a lot of time studying it. Me sort of from a top-down policy point of view, and she from a ground-up social worker's point of view. And I think it is interesting. But I just wanted to draw the distinction. I'm listening to Matt. His point is quite correct, but medical care and social care are entirely different things. I mean, you might as well be comparing, regulation of meat standards or food regulation or something like that. I mean, we use the word care in both cases, but they really don't have very much. They don't even overlap all that much, and the provision of them is quite different. I mean, and that's true in all countries, and in most countries, of course, every other country in the U.S. and then the U.S. makes much better provision of medical care than we do. But nonetheless, even in the U.S. that works. But around the world, generally provision of what you're referring to is the word care that you use, of which child care and old age care, you could add in,
right,
handicapped people or something, but basically child care and old age care is 90% of it. And, that really varies. Medical care isn't all that different around the world, except for the US, but social care is quite different in different countries. And it's actually not just Japan, but it's interesting to look at several of them, I think. But so at another time, we'd be happy to talk about that.
And thank you, John. That's a really helpful distinction. And while we're talking to Matt, I just want to congratulate him on getting his Zoom feed stabilized. I don't know if you've been aware, but you've been in a strobe-like kind of disco Zoom camera for quite a while now.
Me? Oh, I have no idea why that was. Okay. Sorry.
No, not you, John. Matt.
Oh, not me.
Yeah.
Oh, Matt. Oh, I see. Yeah,
Matt
that's
was
right. He
coming
did
in
look
and
nice and clear there.
this peculiar strobe effect. Flossie, go ahead.
Something is happening in the kind of care we receive if we have help where where language becomes a factor. If our help, and I'm using help very indiscriminately, if we have people who help us, who have problems with language, they tend to be more submissive and less aware of their rights as workers. So, for example, if I have a worker or helper who speaks English and I run over time asking for too much help, she will say, I leave at this time, thank you very much. Or she will tell me that I cannot receive help if I'm calling a nurse and the nurse perceives that my requirements are not emergency. she will tell me that we don't do this. This is not an emergency call. Now, I'm not registering this as a complaint.
I
It
understand.
is help. It means that when we receive help in our 80s and 90s, we also have to be aware that under no circumstances do we take this help for granted. With our family, we can ask for another 5 minutes. With our help, we are not able to do that. There's a different aspect to caring. I think that's what we're talking about. There is caring that comes out of affection, and there is caring that has a definition of time, place, circumstance. When the hour is up, you leave. And if somebody is screaming after you, but you didn't pick this up, too bad.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you have a right to be screaming. It means a certain awareness of your position. Even in the most enlightened of communities, you have to be able to behave yourself because you are also a human being who is aware of the rights of others.
And so I want to say a
That
couple
can be hard
things
sometimes.
in response to that very rich comment, Flossie, and you get at the kind of moral texture of these relationships very nicely, I think.
Thank
To start with, there's a quote that I keep coming back to from Ai-jen Poo in her Age of Dignity. She refers to this as the paradox of care, and she's referring to paid care labor. And so, right, I think, maybe to flesh this out a little bit, we should maybe talk about paid routine care labor, right? And so you may need help with the shower. You may need help with your laundry. You may need help with your food or your medicines, etc. Right? That's not medical care, which is something distinct, but that kind of care, often we get a home health aide or some such to assist us in doing those routine self-care activities that we're no longer capable of managing for ourselves. Ai-jen Poo refers to the paradox of care in simple terms. We can pay people who care, but we can't pay people to care, right?
Yes.
And so I don't know, but I imagine you have perhaps had the experience of paying somebody to do something that it matters that they do it well, what their attitude is, what their level of attunement to the person that they're providing the service for is, and they frankly don't care, right? They're indifferent. And that doesn't, right, make anybody very happy, right? But when you get somebody who cares, and it might just be because they have a high level of emotional intelligence, or they're just a sympathetic, compassionate person, or it might be, as I think is often the case, because they have religious motivations, because they think of this as good work and showing respect for the dignity of one of God's fellow creatures, right? There are different ways people get to caring, but it puts them in a difficult situation. It makes them, in a sense, vulnerable to exploitation because they care. And this is particularly pronounced in the situation where the person is a live-in health provider, right? And especially where this is an informal arrangement. So do you, when the person you're caring for wakes up in the middle of the night and needs to go to the bathroom, right? And you know that this person will likely fall if you don't assist them, do you pull yourself out of bed, even though you're not technically on the clock, and assist them, right? And this is somebody who cares and who's paid to care is going to have a very hard time not assisting, right? And so there's a vulnerability to exploitation that comes out of caring. And then you add to that, because you started with language, Flossie, right? And language by itself limits your mobility and security, right? If you don't speak the dominant language in your society, your opportunities are limited. You add to that, you're probably not as informed about your rights. And then what is the right typical situation, or what does lack of language ability often reveal? It often reveals also that the person did not grow up in this society, and that increases the likelihood that they are here sans papier, without documentation, and that therefore not only are they not going to assert themselves, but there's a risk if they assert themselves, right? If they become too assertive, maybe somebody calls immigration on them, right? They're worried about their vulnerabilities in that regard as well. And so you can see where we're going, right? That there are multiple vulnerabilities to exploitation on the part of people who do care work. And you're absolutely right. On the one hand, those of us who are well-meaning and just have to bear that in mind in our relations with our care providers. But then there's also a social dimension to this. How do we actually, as a society, begin to think through allowing people to do this work while protecting them from the vulnerabilities that tend to come with doing this work? So yeah, really rich comments. So you can hear, Flossie, that there's a lot going on in this that I've been trying to research and think through. Let's see. It looks to me, well, is anybody else
I have a
wanting
comment. Yes.
Go ahead,
David?
Doris. Yep. Hi.
One aspect that I think needs to be mentioned is this whole business of pension, of 401k, of retirement. And that aspect is only available to the middle class and has been. I can remember when I first started work, there was talk about, well, you need to enter a pension plan. And I said to myself, why do I at 20 need to think about pensions? But I think that it's very necessary today, isn't it? More so than it was.
Yeah.
And you know, it's all about economics again, about how you retire and how you cared for.
So thank you, Doris. And I'll start with a brief comment. So I teach at a community back east, and we were having a conversation, a retirement community back east, the other day, and somebody raised her hand and said, "You know, we're all teachers here." And I said, "No, I didn't know that." And she said, "Yeah, well, the only way we can afford to be here is because we had a good union and they got us good pensions, and our pension funds pay for us to be here." And I asked the number of people for whom that was true to raise their hands, and it was almost half the people in the room, right? And it's kind of a Piedmont Gardens of the East Coast. It's a nice, well-run, smart, interesting retirement community. And it had never occurred to me that it was the pension fund paying for, and it was mainly women in this case, the women to be in the community. So yes, right, you know, and care is expensive. And let me put it this way, Doris, and I'm going to use the ugly political science language for this. Over the last 40 years, we have been more and more, quote, responsibilized. And what that means is that each of us individually is more and more responsible for our own well-being. What used to be a social responsibility, what used to be, right, society and the government saying, we will help out in these situations, is now, you better save, because your Social Security is not going to be adequate to cover the cost of your retirement. You better have a 401k. You better invest in a pension, right? And we could keep going. but yes, this is part of the issue. And let us be honest, Doris, you say middle class. You know, the middle class is being hollowed out. And it's statistically, demographically speaking, we used to be a majority middle class society. Now we're a minority middle class society. And some people have moved up into the upper middle classes. A lot of people have moved down into the more precarious classes. Those are people who are just struggling to pay their bills, to keep food on the table, housing over their heads, medical expenses paid, the car running so they can get to work. They are not in a position to pay for retirement, to save, etc. And it's at their peril. But having said that, it's the economic reality of their situation. And we do have an elder poverty crisis in the United States. So I do think these things all go together and suggest, well, yes, if you're in a position to do it, it's certainly the prudent and savvy thing to do, to save a large amount for your retirement. My father lives not too far from you guys, says to me, boy, if I'd known I was going to live this long, I would have saved more and worked for longer, right? You know, but you know, it's really hard to do that. Let's see. Ruth has a comment in the chat. So she's referring us to Wendy Lustbatter's book called Counting on Kindness. Yes, and I have seen that. I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list of good books on this topic. Thank you, Ruth. That discusses the challenges of accepting dependency on a caregiver. Yeah, and doing so, I think, ethically is also Flossie's point, right? All right, everyone. We've gone a long time today. Any final comments? So you all take care, stay dry to the best of your ability, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next Saturday. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.